Should be up right now.
It's popping up now.
Okay, awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and start the webinar.
It does look like it doesn't have the three of us up though, so it must be on a whoever's the speaker mode kind of thing. I don't know if you can, because it's popping back and forth between me and you.
Okay.
There we go. Now it's got
awesome.
the three of us up.
Okay, excellent. Okay, everybody. Aloha and welcome to the Kauai Invasive Species live webinar here for Hawaii Invasive Species Awareness Month. Aloha, everybody that's tuning in right now. I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Halen Chalk. I'm the KISC Outreach Specialist here on Kauai, joined by my panelists. Here we have Tiffany Keanini, our project supervisor, and Kim Rogers, our ROD Outreach Specialist. All right, so we just have some housekeeping rules to go over today. So we will be covering our questions for the end of the webinar today. So if you just like to drop any questions throughout our presentation in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, we will be going through those at the end. And we also have a poll for Hawaii Invasive Species Awareness Month. So I'll go ahead and make that available at the end of our presentation as well. And other than that, I'm excited to get this presentation started. Thank you for joining us today, everyone. All right, so I'm just gonna go ahead and set up our screen sharing real quick. Let's see. And here we are. Okay, so again, welcome everybody who's joining in today. Today we're going to be talking about how to be a friend to the forest. I'm going to go ahead and start us off, and we're going to get started, and we're going to start here. So what does it mean to be a friend to the forest? So to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be a good friend to each other? For myself, any relationships that I have in my life, I make it a point to know my friends really well, to know their dislikes, their likes, how can I best support them? And I like to think of us in a way of our connection to our forest. So what is our connection to place? How do we get to know our forest? Whether that you're on Kauai, up in Kokee, or you're on another island, I really invite all of you to think about our forest and your connection to place in this way. So moving on to the next slide, we talk about our connection and our pilina. And for me, pilina means a deep interpersonal connection with place. This could be relationship, connection. You can have pilina with people. You can have pilina with the place that you were born and raised, the place that you're living in now. So when we're thinking about relationship and knowing our forest, I like to think of it in that term of pilina, being pili to a place. So some questions you can ask yourself throughout this process of getting to know your forest is, where are you accessing your forest? What species are you familiar with? Are there any species that you aren't familiar with when you go into these places? And do you know of any threats to the forest? And again, going back to connection and knowing your place. So when we think about having that connection, we also think about the broader scope of how we're accessing. So here on Kauai, we have a lot of beautiful lush forests, and that can be accessed through either the North Shore or through Kuke'e on the west side. Even right here in Wailua, I'm located right now. So if we zoom out from looking at management and resource management and protecting places like the forest and fragile ecosystems, we zoom out to where we are. So some of you may be familiar with these terms, but I'm just going to go through them for people that may not be familiar with these terms. So we go out to moku. So moku could mean a district or an island. For me, I'm in the moku of Puna here on Kauai. And the forest that I access is right here in Wailua. Then we go into another division, which is another vertical form of division, which is an ahupua'a. So an ahupua'a usually is defined as being extended from the uplands to the sea. But again, this is different for every place, for every moku, for every ahupua'a of where you are. I am located right here in this bottom right area. This is the ahupua'a of Wailua. And then we go further in to another division of resource management. So we're looking at VAU. VAU is not a typically common term that we talk about besides moku and ahupua'a. So VAU is actually a lateral division of land to know where our resources are within a given moku or ahupua'a. So what are the function of VAU? I want us to think about how resource management and knowing these different ecosystems are so different from the deep ocean to the tops of the forest to places like Alakai Swamp that have very specialized ecosystems and very rare plants and different animal species that live up there. So VAU were meant to be a function of resource management within the moku to monitor the ecological zones, which we can keep track of the impacts that are happening to these places like the uplands and the Vaukele and the Vauakua. And we're just gonna get into the different VAU that are within each ahupua'a. So here's an example from a lovely figure, and it's a study done by Kavika Winter, Dr. Mehana Vaughn, Malia Kutagawa, and many other notable scientists in the conservation community here. I really love this figure because it shows a vertical division of how an ahupua'a was managed and how resources were managed. So we're gonna just start at the bottom. Right here is the Kai Kohola, which is the deep ocean. For me in Wailua, that's going to be the far out in front of Wailua Bay when I'm out of my canoe. We get closer to land, that's gonna be the Kailuhe'e. So Kailuhe'e would be considered the tidal zones here on Kauai. That would be Lidgate, Nawiliwili, even as far as Anahola, that's when we're getting into the border of another moku. Then we get into Vaukanaka. So Vaukanaka are places where people do a lot of commerce, where Kapa'a town is, Lihue, places where people are living. So Kanaka meaning people. And then above that, we get to the Vaula'au, which could be considered an agroforest area where we have species like ulu and uala and places that we typically would farm. For me in Wailua, that would be like Wailua River Valley. That's a place where I'm very familiar with being a Vaula'au. And then we get into the upper parts of the forest. So right now I would be considered in the Vaunahele. So this is the upper part of Wailua, close to Moalepe Trail and Loop Road, if you're familiar with those places here on Kauai. So the Vaunahele, around me in this place, we're gonna start seeing more things like maile and lehua, more abundance of lehua up here. It's a bit of a cooler climate, there's more rain. And then we get into the Vaukele and the Vauakua, which is gonna be our forest on, this is what we're focusing on today. So the Vaukele, if we look at the word kele, so kele means like wet, damp, swampy, watery. So when we get into the upper forest, if you've ever been to Koke'e or up in Limahuli Valley, for example, you know that there's a good chance, especially at this time of the year, that it's going to be rainy. So when we think about that definition of Vaukele, we're in this division where the rain band starts to happen, where a lot of moisture is, and that opens access for a lot of more rare species, more ferns. And then we get into the Valakua. So Valakua is going to be considered the most sacred, the pinnacle, the top of our watershed. And we're looking at the upper forest as where the whole water process, the watershed process happens for us. So let's move on to Valakua. And this is where our forest comes into play again. So we're zooming in from Moku to Ahupua'a to Vau, and it's particularly Valakua, which is going to be our forest. So Akua is typically translated to God or gods. But if we take that definition, put it to the side, I want us to think in a conservation text lens of it being a natural phenomenon and a processes that is beyond human control. So if you see this photo right here, which is also the background of our presentation today, this was taken at Kalalau Lookout. And as you can see, this is like in person happening, live and direct transpiration and precipitation. These are all processes that charge our aquifer. The clouds are being brought up from Kalalau and then being caught by all of those ohia trees and uluhe ferns. And these are all species that make up our upper Valakua, our deep forest. So when we look at Valakua being a name for the upper forest, it's because these are very, very important ecological zones that we need to protect. And then we get into the term kapu. So here we have a restriction. So sometimes it's considered forbidden or restricted. But in conservation terms, we think about maybe restricting off certain zones that have very rare plants in the Valakua, in our forests. And that's the same thing that we would think of as having for our friend. So being a friend to the forest is also understanding that there are places of the forest that need to be deeply protected. And for me, that term would be kapu. And we protect these places because we know how fragile the ecosystem is. As you can see in this photo right here, we have some Himalayan ginger right at that lookout. And this is an example of how invasive species can get into these fragile ecosystems. And that's why we set boundaries in conservation. We have boundaries, which are also called palena. And then going back to thinking of the forest as our friend, what are the palena that we're setting and what are the palena that we're crossing when we go into these places? So we're asking ourselves, how are we accessing it? Are we accessing it responsibly? When we're going into the Valakua and we're looking at processes of Kane and Kanehoalani working together, how are we as conservationists and even just people in Hawaii going through our natural ecosystems like this? So now that we are thinking about how we're acting in these places, we have to think about protocol. For me as a hula dancer, I often do an oli or a hula because it is a sacred place. It's a kapu place. It's a place that we have restrictions, we want to protect it. But there's also conservation protocol. And that's why we have things like biosanitation and cleaning our tools and treading lightly, making sure not to bring foreign species in and making sure we're not taking anything unnecessary out. So together, we have this working system of aloha aina and understanding our place, but within conservation and cultural protocol, we are working together. They're all one and the same as aloha aina. So here we are, we have the conservation protocol on the right and the cultural protocol on the left, but together they meet in the middle. So both honor the kapu of the forest and protect the physical and as well as the cultural resources of these places. So now that we know who our forest is and where we're accessing our forest and how we're conducting ourselves in these sacred spaces, we need to move on and think about how are we affecting the species within these places. And now I'm going to hand the mic over to Tiffany Kianini, who will be speaking with us more about the residents of our forest.
Thank you, Halen. So being part of being a good friend of the forest is recognizing the residents, as Halen said, and our forest biodiversity, and specifically the native species that can be found within our forest. A good example here is Ohia lehua, seen here on the left. Kim Rogers will actually be going into more depth on this one. Another example would be our famed Evie bird pictured on the right. There's a lot of biodiversity on our island and within our forests, and knowing the residents within that is going to help us identify those invasive species that could threaten them. There we go. There's a little bit of a lag, sorry about that. So what's an invasive species? It's a non-native introduced species that causes economic, environmental, ecological, agricultural, or social harm via harm to humans. Not all introduced species will become invasive. There's a variety of characteristics of invasive plants that increase their ability to harm our forests or ecosystem. We can use some of the common forest invaders as an example. Unfortunately, if you've hiked in the Hawaiian forest before, you've likely come across two of these invaders pictured here. Himalayan ginger is a common one. It's initially spread by those beautiful seeds that you see in those flowers there, the reason we brought it to Hawaii. And then once it becomes established from the spreaded seed, it spreads vegetatively through the rhizomes and forms these thick mats dominating the complete understory of the forest. Without control of this Himalayan ginger, it'll completely outcompete the native understory species and prevent any new native seedlings from establishing in the area. Another example would be strawberry guava. You can see here the strawberry guava forms these thick monotypic stands in the forest, outcompeting all of the other forest species. If you've come across a strawberry guava stand in the forest, you likely looks like this, no other species in the area. So how do we manage these common invasive species? Because they're widespread or found throughout the islands or in more areas, eradication is not likely possible, or successful eradication is not likely possible. So the management focuses on site-specific control techniques that really reduces the population size and minimizes those impacts. Good examples of this are restoration efforts or areas that we have throughout the Hawaiian Islands of preserving some pristine areas. And it's to just minimize the impact to those high cultural and natural resource areas that we want to preserve and protect. Next slide. Moving on to the other end of the spectrum is incipient invasive species. Incipient species are newly introduced, relatively speaking, and found in lower distribution than those common species. One example is common bog rush. This is juncus. This invasive rush easily spreads by tiny seeds stuck in the boots and paws of our along muddy trails. It quickly dominates any of the exposed understory of our forest. Another example would be salvinia. Salvinia is an aquatic floating fern that once it's established in an area, it'll form these dense mats on the water surface, preventing sunlight from reaching the water below, degrading the water quality and reducing the oxygen. So it's important to recognize that invaders of the forest are not just plant species. We also have aquatic invaders that can affect our forest ecosystem, plant invaders, invasive pathogens, animals as well. Next slide. An example of how to manage incipient invasive species is what we focus on here at KISC, or Kauai Invasive Species Committee, and that's early detection and rapid response. The goal of the management is to eradicate the species from the island or a very specific area. A good example of this is juncus found along the Pihea Trail in Kauai. Those red dots were the initial infestation or core infestation area. It was found by a botanist. Then afterwards, next slide, we went out and did an early detection survey to document its spread. And as you can see here, it goes all the way, there's the core infestation, and then it gradually moves along up into the Alakai Swamp Trail and further. And without active control by KISC and our partners, it would continue to spread and get up into the more pristine bog areas and affect that biodiversity. So early detection and rapid response is where you come in as being a good friend of the forest. It's to identify those early invaders and report them. So partners like us have a chance to get out there and control them and put these techniques into play before they have a chance to have a large impact on our ecosystem. Another example of early detection and rapid response by KISC is rapid Ohia death. And Kim Rogers is going to talk about that next, focusing on saving Ohia.
Thanks, Tiffany. Yeah, so I'd like to start with just a brief background. I'm sure many of us here today know what Ohia is, but I'll give a little bit of details. Ohia is literally the most prevalent or the most common tree in our native forests. It is also known as the backbone of our native forests because it is a host to many other species. Interestingly enough, Ohia is endemic to Hawaii. That means if you're standing near an Ohia tree, you know you're in Hawaii. So endemic meaning found here and nowhere else in the world. There happens to be one variety of Ohia. We oftentimes talk about Ohia as if it's one species and they're all exactly alike, but there's great variability among Ohia. There's a variety of species, and then within each species, there are different varieties. There happens to be one variety that is located along the Pihea Trail up in Kauai that is actually endemic to Kauai, meaning found here and nowhere else in the world. It is known as Metrosideros polymorpha variety Dieterei. And like I've got noted here on this slide, Ohia is highly adaptable, meaning at one point in time, Ohia grew on this island from Mauka to Makai. We oftentimes think of it only as that tree in Kokee, but the truth is it grew at all elevations on our island at one time and in all the different microclimates that we have on our island. So even the dry, hot sides of our islands to the very cool, moist parts of our islands. So Ohia is super adaptable in that regard. And that is what quite honestly has made it survive as long as it has and just be so widespread. I like to talk about Ohia's importance in three ways. The first of which is Ohia's importance to our watershed. As this photo illustrates, Ohia, and as Halen mentioned earlier, Ohia have this structurally built-in way of pulling moisture and holding moisture, pulling moisture from the air and then holding it in place. So you can see this on the lehua or the flower, how it's just holding on to those droplets of water. Now, our watershed is super important to protect because our watershed is what's providing us with drinking water. It's what provides us with water to irrigate our agricultural fields, so those things that are feeding us. A super healthy watershed is important to holding soil in place, so we have as little erosion as possible after heavy rains. And so a healthy watershed will ensure a healthy, clean stream and river system, which then extends all the way down to the reef. You know, a healthy forest ensures a healthy reef in the ocean. The second area that I like to talk about that's super important when it comes to Ohia is in our ecosystem, in the environment itself. As we've already pointed out, Ohia and EEV have a very unique relationship, and as well as all of our forest birds to our to Ohia. Ohia provides some form of many different forest birds' life history requirements, but not just forest birds. Ohia also are a home to our native land snails, to many other different invertebrates, as well as they're a host to lots of endangered flora. So other plants rely on Ohia. Many of these plants literally grow on Ohia. So a healthy Ohia forest is one that when you're standing in it, you're just surrounded by moisture. A healthy Ohia forest is a sponge. It pulls moisture from the air and holds it. So all of those lichen and ferns and mosses that are growing on and around Ohia help to create this great biodiversity that Tiffany talked about and ensure a healthy watershed. So watershed Ohia is important to host to other flora and fauna. And the third point I like to make about Ohia is its importance to our host culture here in Hawaii. Many of us are really familiar with Ohia's relationship to lei-making and hula. But at one time, Ohia was also used for its medicinal purposes, and its wood was used in a myriad of different ways, from building hale to heiau to va'a canoes. And Ohia at one point in time, it just permeated the entire Hawaiian culture. From all socioeconomic layers of it. And so just over time, really strong cultural connections to Ohia. So that's the third reason that I like to talk about its importance to us here in Hawaii. So now I'll just segue into this threat known as rapid Ohia death that is unfortunately attacking Ohia specifically. At its simplest, rapid Ohia death is a fungal disease, and it grows inside the tree. It's not a fungus that you're going to see growing on the leaf. You're not going to see it on the flower. You're not going to see it growing on the exterior of the bark. The fungus actually grows inside the tree, in that portion of the tree right behind the bark that is responsible for the flow of water up and down the tree. So basically responsible for watering the tree, keeping the leaves moist and healthy. Unfortunately, when the tree gets diseased with rapid Ohia death, it clogs that flow of water, eventually chokes the tree, all hydration stops, and unfortunately, the tree succumbs to the disease. At this point in time, there is no known cure. There's lots of science being done looking into it. Some of you may be familiar with rapid Ohia death was first starting to get well known on Hawaii Island. And in about 2014, it was determined that it was a fungal disease that was killing Ohia. And then in May of 2018, rapid Ohia death was first discovered on Kauai. A couple of years went by and it was discovered in more places on Kauai, on the southeast side of Kauai, even on the north side. And then unfortunately in December of last year, rapid Ohia death was discovered in the Kauai area. So this next slide will show you a map of where we have detections of rapid Ohia death. So as you can tell, it's looking pretty dispersed throughout the island. Although I want to caution you not to get too upset at this point in time. All these dots that you see represent fewer than 250 trees that we have found, tested, and determined died of rapid Ohia death. So at this point in time, it's not as pervasive as it is on Hawaii Island, but it's certainly concerning. And so with that in mind, I'd like to talk a little bit more specifically. Let's get down to it and how we can be a friend of the forest. And the first thing I want to talk about is biosanitation. And so biosanitation, as we talk about it, especially related to Ohia and rapid Ohia death, is a two-step process. But also keep in mind, by participating in this biosanitation two-step process, you're not only helping prevent the spread of rapid Ohia death around the islands, but you're also helping prevent any spread of additional invasive species. So it's a two-step process. First, use a boot brush. We have many of them at our trailheads around the island. And if you don't have one, or if you don't find one at a trailhead, carry a boot brush in your car, carry a kit. That's what I've started doing. I carry a bin with a boot brush. And then the second step is alcohol. So the first step is boot brush to get as much mud and dirt and soil off your footwear or off your pant legs or off your backpack or even your tires if you're going into a muddy place with your vehicles. That will cut the amount of mud down, and mud is what transports the fungal disease around the island. But the second step is to use alcohol. And the alcohol spray, and this is 70% isopropyl rubbing alcohol, the common stuff that you can typically find across the island, that actually kills the fungal spore. So the fungus that is attacking Ohia is microscopic. You're not going to look on the bottom of your shoes like you would and find a seed. You're not going to see this pathogen. It's microscopic. So the way to ensure that you can stop the spread is the use of this alcohol. And typically we like to say after you spray, wait about 15 seconds so the alcohol can do its work and then proceed on. But don't forget as well, when you leave the forest, don't forget your vehicles, right? Whether you're accessing the forest with a truck, whether you're accessing it with a motorcycle, whether you're accessing it with a bicycle, all of the sundry ways, or just anything that you might be taking into the forest that gets muddy. Don't forget to hose that down, get as much mud off as you can using a high pressure hose off not only your tires, but the undercarriage of your vehicle as well. Sorry, a little bit of a delay here with our slides. So some other things. So biosanitation was the first step, but here's some other things you can do to help be a forest friend. And one is to stay on trails. Don't cut switchbacks. Also stay on maintained trails, you know, try not to carve out new trails in the forest. Don't wound ohia. Wounding ohia or wounds in ohia is the way that rapid ohia death infects the tree. As long as the tree is nice and healthy, doesn't have any wounds, it will stay healthy, even if there are fungal pathogens nearby. So don't wound ohia. By that, I mean, don't break branches, don't scuff up roots, don't, if you can't, blaze trails like notches in the tree. If you need to blaze a trail, use flagging, or use an invasive tree like a strawberry guava to blaze your trail. Also camp in approved locations only, you know, so that we're not impacting more areas of the forest. And by camping in approved locations, we also mean, you know, if you're going to use hammocks, use them in approved camping locations only. And then the last thing on this slide is to leave plants in place. So that means, especially when it comes to ohia, don't move ohia out of the forest, be it even dead wood, because sometimes the rapid ohia death fungal pathogen can live in the dead wood beyond the life of the tree. So if we can get to the next slide, Halen. Slow internet, it looks like today. And the next thing that we can do to be a good friend of the forest is to, as Halen mentioned already, get to know the forest, get to know the ohana in the forest and what you might be coming across, whether that means maybe looking at a guidebook and finding out what are the names of these plants, what purpose do they serve in the forest, how they relate to other forest life, you know, because oftentimes this is ecosystem. One thing relies on something else, relies on something else. So get to know the native plants that you hopefully will be running across in the forest, but as well, get to know the invasives. And you can do that by looking at our KISC website and getting to know the invasives. Then you know what belongs here and what doesn't. And you might even be able to report some of those early sightings of maybe some invasive species that we may not know about. So we do rely on the community to help us identify those. There we go. Thanks, Halen. Another way to get involved in help saving the forest, and I think this is something that a lot of people don't think about, you know, or forget about, and that is speaking up, you know, on behalf of the forest. So it might be a letter to the editor that you write to the your local newspaper. It might be participating in giving testimony during legislation season when there might be bills or laws that are being passed to support the forest and to support the work that's being done in the forest to protect our watersheds. It might be as simple as, you know, talking to your local or your community association about planting native trees or plants in a local park or something like that. But speaking up on behalf of the forest, the more you do that, the greater work and effort that we can do in supporting, you know, your voice, if you will. And I mentioned this already, but reporting. So statewide, there is a hotline, 808-634-PEST. If you see an invasive, please call that number. It's a statewide number. On Kauai, you can also call our direct line at KISC, which is 808-821-1490. Or you can email us by going to our website. You'll find that email address. But like I mentioned earlier, a lot of this, you know, if you're out in the forest and you're a forest user, whatever it is you're doing in the forest, you are our eyes. So please report back to us anything that you might be seeing that you're not familiar with or you think doesn't quite belong there. So those are a variety of ways that I feel like you can be a friend of the forest. And now I'm going to turn things back over to Halen because I think she has something for us next.
You're on mute, Halen.
And you're on mute, Halen.
Here I am. I was just looking at some questions. Seems that we don't have any questions from the audience quite yet. But thank you again to our panelists for that awesome presentation and joining me today. And right here we have a interactive quiz. So if you go to www.menti.com, or you can copy and paste this, or if you can actually, I'll go ahead and put the link into the chat. You can click it from there, and then there's an enter code as well. And then we're just gonna have a quick interactive activity. So just give me a moment. I'm gonna put that into the chat, and then I'll reshare my screen when I get onto the Mentimeter. Okay, just give me one moment.
The Mentimeter link is in the chat on Zoom, and it's also in the chat box or comment box on Facebook Live. I entered it.
Excellent.
So click the link and enter the code below.
Yes. So as we're just giving everyone a couple of moments to enter, I see some people entering right now. All right. Let's see here. I'll give everyone like one more minute to enter in. All right, I see some participants. And here we are. Okay, let's just go ahead and jump right into it. Okay, so we're gonna start our first one here. Everyone, make sure you have your screens open, look at your phone, and you can interact from right on your phone. All right, everyone got it right. Awesome, but we also had extra correct ones. Okay. Here we have our next one. Which plant is Juncus effusus?
Wow, I love this, Halen. You can see it real time, the answers as they
Yep.
change even. Yeah.
And this one's not timed, so everyone, we can keep going through.
Can I vote again?
You can try. All right, so let's see here. We got a couple answers coming in. And actually, the correct answer is option number 2. So we're going into the next one right over here. And, oh, sorry. Enter. So this one's gonna be timed. So everyone get your phones ready. Why is Ohia important to the forest? And they're all correct. So either one you would have picked, it's correct. Ohia, let's see, helps charge the watershed. It is the foundation of the forest, and the kua serve as a food source for native species. And finally, we have one more, just a participation questions. How will you be a friend to the forest? Seems like we have a lot of participation in this one. It's awesome. All right, and all of these are excellent answers. So you can know the impacts of humans in your forest, report incipient species to KISC or any of the ISCs, no matter what island you're on. You can use 643 PEST, and also biosanitize your gear when you're going in and out of the forest, and know your native and invasive species. All right, that is our last question for our Mentimeter. And just opening up the poll one more time to see if anybody would like to participate before we leave. I go ahead and I launched it right now. Let's see. So the poll is up, and then we also don't seem to have any questions going on right now. So if everyone, before you leave, if you could please just participate in our poll for Hawaii Invasive Species Awareness Month. This is going to help us for next year and for any future statewide outreach that we plan to do as a team with the Hawaii Invasive Species committees. We'd really appreciate your participation. And again, mahalo everybody for joining us today for our Kauai Invasive Species, How to Be a Friend to the Forest.
Thank you.
All right, mahalo
Thank
everybody.
you.
Aloha.
Oh, we seem to get some chats in here. Mahalo everybody. Awesome, awesome. Thank you for all these lovely comments. And stay tuned for the rest of the week. This is the last week of Hawaii Invasive Species Awareness Month, and we got a few more talks. We got a great talk tonight. Go ahead and check us out on the Hawaii Invasive Species schedule on DLNR, and go ahead and Google that, and you'll find the rest of the week's schedule for our talks this week. All right.